Hello, thank you for joining us for the Hastings Public Library adult book discussion. Today we are talking about Searching for Sylvie Lee by Jean Kwok. First question, what were some of the cultural differences you picked up on? One of the main things that I noticed is because they have a bit of an Asian background is that after someone has passed away, and they're buried, they dig them up after 10 years to save space. So I found that a little bit disturbing, but I found it fascinating at the same time. I learned a lot about different cultures reading this book.
Was that Asian or the Dutch?
That was the Asian, I believe, because they were buried on the side of the mountain.
I thought it was Dutch. I'll have to look that up.
I thought it was the Dutch side because Europe's long history, they had the need for space. So I always thought it was a Dutch practice.
I could have forgotten that. That's a very good question. Maybe I'm thinking more of the funeral side than the burial side.
That might
But what
be
do you think?
know.
Yeah. What do you think, Joseph, about the cultural differences?
The one thing I really picked up on, and I think Dean did a really good job of illustrating it, was how much the Dutch use bicycles as opposed to, especially the New York City, where Amy and Sylvie came from. I think she does a really good job of showing how uncomfortable Amy is with using a bicycle, whereas people of all ages are so comfortable. And even in Sylvie's chapters, she has to carry her cello on the bicycle, and that just seems so unwieldy, but there's people doing all sorts of stuff like that. So I thought that was really interesting to see, and it was really well depicted.
I agree.
One of the things I noticed was that the Dutch, I guess, just leave their windows open. They don't have curtains to close them. I'd find that unsettling because it's like I want to look out. I don't want people to look in at what I'm doing, like a fishbowl effect.
That was something I was going to say too. It doesn't seem to bother them though to have their windows wide open for everybody to see.
It's pretty ironic when you think about it in terms of the story and how there's so much secrecy in this in the plot, and you know you have these wide open houses, but all these secrets.
That's a really good way of thinking about it.
So like the bicycles, Jean provides a lot of really detailed descriptions of lots of the events that Amy and Sylvie and other characters attend throughout the book. There's Philip's concert, Grandma's funeral, the King's Day Festival. I was wondering which were your favorites and like what images from those stuck out to you. I don't know if I have so much a favorite image as I liked all the different times they were eating food, and I feel like she paid a lot of attention to what they were eating and whether it was what like Sylvie ordered at a cafe or what Willem and Helena were bringing home from their Chinese restaurant for just the family to eat. I really liked all those detailed descriptions, and I think sometimes people are like, oh, don't load it with so much description, but for me it really helped and really put me in the Netherlands, I guess, and all the other spaces too.
I agree with you 100%. I love the description just because it kind of made me feel like she was feeling. And this was not an event, but the time when Helena, it was when, was it Sylvie or Amy were there and they were allergic to the seafood, and she made everything seafood related. It just kind of, it described the food, but it also described how that made her feel. It seemed like the book was just packed full of emotion, and they could relate that to whether it was food or friendships or activities, I guess you could say.
The food always seemed amazing, and it made me hungry.
I believe it was Sylvie with the shellfish allergy because Helena doesn't like her, so she'd always get things that she didn't like. Whereas she was actually pretty courteous to Amy.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's right.
Do you think the title has multiple meanings? Oh yeah, big time. Sylvie was searching for herself. She had her rocky relationship, I guess you could say, with her husband, with her family there in New York versus being in I lost my word here, guys. Where were they at?
Netherlands?
Yes, the Netherlands. Thank you. You know, where she was searching, and then Amy was literally searching for Sylvie. So it had several meanings. What are your guys' thoughts?
I
Yeah.
agree. One thing I think of, though, as far as multiple meanings, it says searching for Sylvie Lee, but I take that as a little bit deeper as far as not just looking for her or her finding herself. It's more like uncovering all of the secrets that the whole family, whether it was family or friends, the whole circle. I don't know if anybody knew Sylvie or her real story.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think, yeah, you can see it almost a different meaning for each of the three narrators. So for Amy, she's very literally searching for Sylvie, what happened to her. Sylvie's very much searching for herself, trying to figure out who she is. And then I think her ma is also trying to figure out, who was Sylvie? I sent her to the Netherlands as a young child and didn't get to raise her. What did I miss? Who is the Sylvie I didn't get to know and see? So yeah, I think definitely more meanings than I initially thought. I thought it was going to be very straightforward, like what happened to Sylvie, but
Yeah.
it's all those different things.
Definitely. And I think it's interesting that they used searching, instead of just searching for Sylvie, they put searching for Sylvie Lee, which I think is a huge part of the story, where you find out it's not searching for Sylvie Tan, it's searching for Sylvie Lee.
So as we said, the story is told from Amy's point of view and Sylvie, so the two sisters, and then there's also Ma's point of view, which is very important to the story. But if there had been like a fourth narrator, who would you want it to be and why? You know, I think there's kind of an obvious answer, like to keep it within the women of the family, like Helena would have a very interesting
Yeah.
standpoint there. I was kind of thinking, what if you did sort of like an unnamed fourth character who was one of the men and you didn't know which one until the end of the story? And so some of those secrets would come out. And then at the end, you know, I don't know, it could be Philip, and you know, there were these feelings for Lucas or something like that. So I think that could be an interesting point.
I like your answer better than what I was going to say. I was going to say I think it would be cool to have added Willem's perception of things, because, and I'm sure that the author did this on purpose. The whole book, I just thought he had some kind of creepy crush on her, and so finding out at the end that it was something much more meaningful had a huge impact. But getting to kind of, I think she still could have done it in a way that was mysterious and still kind of led you on, but it would have been kind of cool to have added that aspect, I think.
Joseph, I also agree with you, and that for me, I would have been interested to see Helena's point of view, because we eventually find out why she doesn't like Sylvie so much. And we see so much of her resentment throughout the book. But I think internally it would have been interesting to see how deep that resentment ran and how the thoughts in her head worked regarding Sylvie. Like, did she ever struggle internally with how she treated her? Did she ever try to be nice to her? Or was it just solid and dying resentment?
Yeah,
I agree with you both. And I think Helena did. She did try to care about Sylvie, because it talked about the times, the tender times when she would comb her hair and and do those things. So it was like she was trying very hard to be nice and take care of the daughter, but then it kind of snapped her out of it of who this child was, and then she'd go back being cold, hateful Helena.
Well, she also talked too about that she really did truly love Sylvie. It was just those
Mhm.
other nasty feelings kept getting in the way.
Yeah.
Which character did you relate to most? For me, it would have to be Amy. First of all, I've never been out of the country. Second of all, I think it would be if one of my siblings were to go missing, that would be my main purpose in life, would be to go find them. And it struck me as odd that nobody else was really doing that or really taking it seriously. So Amy is definitely the one I would relate to most.
I think I would actually relate to Sylvie more, just because my situation was definitely not like hers. Grew up in a great home with loving parents, but I too was the older sister. So I didn't technically have to take care of my sister. She's not that much younger than me, but I was always the first, and so I was kind of always the leader. And still to this day, if there's a question or if there's a problem, you go to Sam to ask. So I do understand and not wanting to let people down, whether you have the answer or not. And I know Sylvie had a lot of those feelings where even if it was financial help, she wanted to help her sister just to prove that she was there for her. And two, I relate to the searching part. I feel like I'm a constant work in progress, and I'm always looking for ways to learn and better myself. I just think Sylvie's was on a much deeper, darker level than myself.
Yeah.
Do you think Amy would have grown as a character as much as she did if she knew the real Sylvie, the internal Sylvie? Personally, I think she wouldn't, because the Sylvie she knew was more of a facade, like the air of confidence and wealth and assuredness and determination. Whereas if she knew that Sylvie struggled just as much as she did, then maybe I don't think she would have been as willing to just go do it, because that's what Sylvie would have done.
And to me, it seemed like Amy just all of a sudden, okay, Sylvie's missing. I now have to step in and be Sylvie. Let's get it done. She took on that role of Sylvie, and I don't think she could have done that had she known the other part of her.
Yeah. She's always like, oh, well, Sylvie would have just done it. No question. She would have, whatever had to happen, no muss, no fuss, would have made it work.
Yeah, it kept her from actually growing until she discovered that there was more to Sylvie.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Sylvie would have been different if she would never have come back to America as a young child? I think she would have been different, but I think she would have had a little bit more grounded idea of where she belonged when she was sent back to America with the parents she didn't really know. She thought that they didn't really care about her and that they didn't really want her in the same way that they did their, beloved Amy. But I think it would have been very, I don't know if I want to say traumatic, but it would have been very hard to continue to live with Helena.
Oh, yeah.
And Willem, because he kind of creeped her out because of how he was looking at her. And then Helena was so cold, and then she would warm up and then turn cold again. I think that would just, I don't know, devastate her still, but in a different way.
I can definitely see what you're saying. I think that's definitely true. I think it definitely would have caused a lot of harm. But at the same time, moving back caused a lot of issues for her in terms of just being able to relate to people, because she saw herself as just being like a glorified babysitter, and that was the only reason her parents wanted her back. Whereas in the Netherlands, she had her grandmother looking out for her and caring for her as a loved one. And I think that would have made much more of an impact than anything she experienced with Helena.
Good point.
I also kind of wonder if her moving back to America I feel like she had this point in the book where she was like, okay, I'm now this person who needs to succeed. And she sort of really works so hard at being someone who can like get into the business and corporate side of things. And she also comments on how she's never been like the musical one or the artsy one, even though you see her with Philip learning the cello and really starting to embrace that. So I wonder if staying in the Netherlands would have helped her in those sort of fields, learn to embrace that better. And I think she did have people like her grandma and Lucas to sort of help her and have some sort of supportive setting to foster those things. So
That's a wonderful point, because like you said, in America, she probably did what the American dream. She found the blonde hair, blue-eyed guy. She married out of college. She did the business degree thing instead of finding a true person that she loved, understanding herself and finding what would make her happy. So that's an excellent point.
Not only that, but it would have included, as a kid growing up, instead of focusing on Amy's well-being, she could have focused on her own and growing those own interests herself.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think Helena resented Sylvie? For obvious reasons, it's because she knew the secret of Willem, but I also think she was jealous of her relationship with Lucas and Grandma. She also, at least Helena thought she knew where the jewels were, and had something to do with that, even as a small girl. I just think, yeah, with all the secrets, I just think Helena didn't know what to do with all of her frustration and all of her questions either.
I think a lot of the resentment, yeah, you said, was that Grandma really loved Sylvie and wanted to give her everything. And I think Helena hated that, resented her for that, because she's financially was taking care of her, you know, seeing to that. But on the emotional level, she was so much closer to Sylvie. And I think Helena hated that, as well as who her true parentage was. So,
Right.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both of you. I think on the surface, Helena came across as a mean-spirited, resentful person, but I think underneath she was just very insecure and just wanted people's love.
And a lot of pain,
Yeah.
for sure. What was one of the biggest surprises in the book for you? I kind of was figuring it out throughout the book, but when Philippe had expressed his true emotions for Lucas, I'm like, oh, I knew it! Because when they were in Venice and they were talking about his blue button-down shirt and his jacket and his pants in that way, I'm thinking this guy has a lot more. He pays a lot more attention to how he's dressed and how he behaves than Lucas, where Lucas is kind of the, well, I'm dressed, it's good enough kind of thing. So I was wondering about Philippe. So that it surprised me, but it didn't, just because they gave subtle hints, but if you really weren't paying attention, you might not notice.
I think for me, I was listening to the book, and when they were finally going over the part with what happened to Sylvie when she took the pills and drove her car, I was like, I literally went, no! I didn't want her to kill herself. I didn't want that. And that was probably one of the biggest surprises for me. I didn't think she would have done it.
Dana, I totally agree with you on that, because the whole book I was thinking it was a murder mystery. And the author was so clever in the way she set it up, where each person had a motive and a means to do it, and it totally took me by surprise.
I agree with that, because I thought it was Lucas. I did. I thought he was the sperm, what do you call it? She didn't want his advances, and that he did it because it was at their spot at the lake.
Well, and he even said, yes, I killed Sylvie. So you're thinking, oh, but then he didn't mean it as physically. Yeah, no, I guess I do agree with you there. And I was trying so hard throughout the book to pretend like something bad didn't happen to her, that we would find her in Venice or somewhere with the jewels, you know?
Well, I think that everything that you read about it beforehand also suggested that the end will surprise you, you know, that kind of thing. So
I actually thought it was going to be Philip who murdered her. So that brings me to my next question. What was your reaction when you found out that the man that jumped on Amy's bike was Philip? And are you satisfied with the resolution in the story of his deception toward Amy? And I know that Philip was, he jumped on the bike and kind of set up this whole thing so that he could kind of get Amy to look for Sylvie because he knew Lucas was going to talk bad about him and make it all sound not okay. But I just still think it was pretty devious. I know it came from a good place, but it was still pretty devious. And it was unsettling to me that she was like, oh, okay, yeah, you're fine then. It was just kind of an odd resolution to me that he was now totally okay. And it was totally okay that he wasn't really interested in her and was just doing it to get what he wanted.
If a guy would jump on a woman's bike here in the United States, he'd probably get a backpack upside the head. So for her not to do anything, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's just more to that. I mean, I wanted more of that story, and I wasn't getting Philippe's story enough of his. So it didn't really surprise me that he jumped on her bike or that it was him, because I felt like something was missing.
Yeah. It surprised me by how much of an emotional reaction I had to it, because I was actually listening to the audiobook and this whole scene came about and you find out that it was Philip, and I just started yelling at him saying, this is so creepy, what are you doing? And my husband was just looking at me like I was really goofy. But yeah, it just really got to me that he was doing this. And you know, it's one of those, like in a horror movie where you just want to tell the main character, don't trust him. But yeah.
Don't go in that room.
Yep.
I think sort of thinking about it like as a modern murder mystery, you sort of had all these characters around Sylvie, but they were all like family members and really close. And I was like, oh, these all feel too obvious to be the sort of the person who did it. So when Philip enters Sylvie's story and then he comes into Amy's story, it was very like, oh, this is the mysterious guy, what's going to happen? And like I was sort of expecting it to go like, I don't know, if Philip would capture Amy and then hold her with Sylvie or something. But then the way it sort of did resolve, I thought was really interesting. And yeah, I really liked the way he sort of just got close to Amy and was like getting her to get the family sort of past their grief and not wanting to know, and getting the divers involved and actually figuring it out. I think I really liked how that resolved, even if it was definitely a little creepy and weird and I didn't know quite where it was going, but I liked it as a plot point at least.
Interesting.
So many of the characters had secrets. Do you think things would have been different if the characters hadn't kept their secrets? Does that make sense? Like
Yeah,
if
it does. I think things would have ended a lot happier for a lot more of the characters if they could have been more honest with each other, like how Sylvie and her mom thought that each other didn't really care for each other, but they actually did. And Sylvie having to basically put on this facade of like, I'm a put together person, I have it under control, and really she was struggling and she needed some help. And of course, a really big one, like maybe don't fall in love with your half brother. I think she would have appreciated to know that. I think that was a straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah, I agree. And I think things would have turned out drastically different because if Sylvie would have known who her true father was, even if she was in the United States, she could have had relationships and with both sides and maybe even mended a little bit with Helena. But then too, she would have had a belonging. She didn't ever belong anywhere. No one, even though they loved her, she never belonged, and no one loved her, and she didn't know who she was for all of those years. So I think it would have changed. She wouldn't have just settled, I think, for everything.
Do you think if Ma would have told the truth in the beginning, that she still would have married Pa and Helena and, okay, what's his name?
Willem?
Willem would have gotten together? Or do you think Ma and Willem would have gotten together?
No, he chose Helena.
Yeah, but he didn't know, right?
That's true.
If Ma would have been upfront with him, because he did love Ma.
I thought she said that she told him before she left China, but he picked Helena anyways.
He found, if I recall, that he found out after,
She had married Pa.
yeah, when they were there, and she was going to bring, she was not going to follow through with the plan to have Sylvie stay with Willem and Helena. But then Willem found out it was his daughter, and then he asked her to have Sylvie stay with him. Right? Am I remembering that
Right.
correctly?
No, you're right. Yeah. And he said maybe even just for a year or for two, but it ended up being 9 years.
Yeah.
I think that's the interesting thing is there are ways where this story could have gone better for everyone if the secrets came out, but it's a matter of when they came out, because I think if they do come out too early, I don't know if the family has even as good of a relationship as they have at that moment. Maybe there's too much bad blood while the children are still young, as opposed to, I don't know, maybe like when all of them reach adulthood, sort of coming to it very maturely and saying, this is the case, we want you all to get together, get along together and all that. I think that is maybe the best case. So I don't know.
That's a good point.
All the secrets do make it a good story, though.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of that, deception is a large part of the story. What do you think of the way the grandmother decided to give the jewels to Sylvie before she died? And what about her deception with her timing of euthanasia? I definitely can see how this idea of you need to have secrets kind of got passed along throughout the family. And I think it definitely contributed to the way Sylvie felt. Because of course it backfired with the jewels. Helena, of course, figured it out and blamed Sylvie for it. And it just became another thing that kind of was a barrier between the two of them. And then Sylvie felt like it was like she lost something, and that her grandmother didn't want her there. So she took it as another disconnect from the people that she loved, and like, oh, I'm just not good enough to be a part of their real lives. So I felt like it did a lot of damage, and it really contributed to the way Sylvie felt.
Yeah, especially with that euthanasia, that grandma didn't want them there, and that's because she loved them and didn't want to put them through that, or didn't want them to try and talk her out of it. But I thought that was kind of a bad deception.
Well, and I can't remember again if it was the Dutch or the Asian culture that the book referenced, as far as they had their windows open, they appeared to be open, and everything was fine. But truthfully, everything was not fine with people. Does that make sense? I remember the book talking about everything looks fine to everyone here, but nothing is what it seems.
Yeah, it was a Dutch.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So it could very much relate to that, but the deception, and I can see why the grandma wanted to be euthanized on her own. She didn't want them to be sitting there and sad and crying. She wanted them to remember her as she was, Lucas and Sylvie, anyway.
Yeah, that one I guess makes more sense to me. It's the jewels. I was just like, really? This is how you're deciding to pass on your legacy, is putting up this crazy scheme of having your granddaughter steal them from you. It was just very odd to me.
She didn't even do it well. Sylvie's a terrible thief. Like, I'm gonna take the only thing of value, not even mussy up the place. So when she thinks like maybe I should take something else to make it look like a robbery, she's like, maybe I'll take this origami for like folded paper. I'm like, a real thief doesn't care about the paper. Maybe it is valuable, but they don't know that. They're looking for jewels and electronics and like things they can grab quickly.
Right.
Yeah, very true. But I think that scene was important because it showed how much Sylvie truly loved and cared about every single one of them, and how heartbreaking it was for her that she never felt really connected.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because she's like, no, I'll be okay. I'll be a great thief. And I'm like, no, she's not going to be a great thief. But turn around, she bungled the whole thing. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds right. Do you agree with Amy and that to die by water would be a self-fulfilling prophecy? Why or why not? I think it is, because it's like Amy said, like if you avoid it the entire time and don't know how to swim, then if you find yourself in a situation where you have to swim, you're not equipped to handle that and you would drown. And it's I've always seen that it's always to die by water. It's never like to die by fire or to die by air, or to die by earth or something. It's like the most avoidable of the elements. Like don't go anywhere near water because it doesn't work with any of the other ones.
That's true.
I had to stop, and I was like, okay, wait a minute. The drowning, the water, there's something significant religiously. Wait a minute, they were Buddhists. And so I had to stop and look it up. And in Buddhism, water symbolizes life, the purest form of food, and water is the particular element in which nature carries everything together. So I think with Sylvie, it was, I'm going back where I came from in the most purest form.
Interesting.
And that's I guess my brain.
And that's kind of ironic. It means life, and that was what was going to bring her death.
Yeah, I think the way I looked at the prophecy was it's sort of not self-fulfilling, at least in this story, but like the way you sort of get like a fortune or something and you're like finding ways that your life fits into that fortune as opposed to it just happening because it must. So I think with her having that in her mind, it led to this, I guess what in her mind was this very like beautiful, I guess is the word, but the way she did it was like, oh, I went to the spot I love. But I think it also made her much more quicker to make that decision. She sort of put all the pieces of the family secrets together and then was like, oh, this is what I must do, and it fits because I'm to die by water. And so, yeah, I think it was a bit of an unfortunate sort of prophecy that it didn't have to be self-fulfilling. Like she could have. So.
In regards to Sylvie's death, while we're on that note, before you reach the end of the book, what did you think happened to Sylvie and why? Like, did you really think she was taking some time to herself? Was she murdered? Did she kill herself? I thought she was murdered because I've heard and watched way too much true crime to see suddenly someone disappear off the face of the map and it's like they're just taking their time to themselves. It's like historically not the case. And then they found her at the bottom of the lake, and it's like, yeah, that tracks. But originally, I thought she was murdered, and I thought it was going to be Wilhelm that killed her, because everyone was suspicious, everyone had a motive, and they did a good job. She did a good job writing that. But as they kind of started checking off everyone one by one, William was the only one who was still really vague and creepy. And I thought, that guy's a murderer. That makes sense.
Her true dad?
Yeah.
What, her dad? Okay. I thought it was,
and that was like before the end of the book, like before you reveal, before they reveal that she drove herself in.
I thought it was her. Am I going to be this man's lover, or is he my brother? I thought it was him. Lucas did it. Or yes, she went and hid in a cave somewhere in Tibet to get away from all these crazy people.
For a brief moment, I thought, was she still in, like, did she just abscond to Venice with the jewels and maybe she is alive? That was the only case I thought she'd be alive, but it wasn't likely that I thought.
I definitely thought it was a murder as well. And like I said before, I thought it was Philip. Joseph and
funny.
Sam, you said.
Interesting how they. Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask Joseph and Sam, what did you think it was murder? And if so, who did you think the murderer was?
I don't know. I was going to say that it's really interesting how it goes to Venice and you're like, oh, maybe she just stays in Venice. And then I think the ending of that chapter is really interesting where it's like, and then I came back from Venice and it was such a beautiful experience. And you're like, oh my gosh, what is really going to happen now? Because it's not Venice. So yeah, for me, that was a big surprise.
Yeah.
I thought it was a murder too. And my mind kind of goes between Lucas and Helena, just because I knew Lucas loved her too much to do anything, but just like one of those heat of the moment things because every possible thing for them was going wrong. So I thought maybe he snapped, but then Helena, when Sylvie disappeared, she's around, thinking, if you got rid of somebody, you wouldn't be super excited to help go search for her.
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it definitely came across suspicious. Each family member's decisions impacted Sylvia's final decision in the story. Is there one person you think is most to blame for the way things turned out for Sylvie? For me, I would say it would be Ma. If she had, I just think people make mistakes, but to just send her daughter to go live with her biological father and his wife, I don't know why she thought that would end well, and it just struck me as super irresponsible, and everything just kind of unraveled because of that.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think it was Ma's fault.
I agree. It almost seems a little selfish, and I, as a parent, I understand worrying about the financials and things like that, but I don't know. It just seems like even as a parent, when things are tough, you still take care of your kid, you buck up, you make things work. Just saying I could handle being away from my child for a year or two and then turning it into 9, I think at that point I would have just said, I don't know this child, and I hope that she's happy with you. I don't know.
I agree with it being selfish in terms of she put she prioritized Willem's feelings and desires over her daughter's, because of course her daughter would have rather have stayed with her.
Personally, I think Helena is the one most to blame for the way things turned out with Sylvie, because I think she's the root of Sylvie's feeling of disconnection to other people. Because growing up in the Netherlands, granted she wasn't generally accepted by the Dutch people, but she had grandma and she had Lucas, and those were really strong, good connections. It was just that Helena was so negative and hateful towards her that it created more of the beginning of her separation from other people, to me.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
It's kind of the negative voice she carried in her head throughout her adulthood.
Yeah.
Do you think this book and this story, does it have a happy ending? I mean, we get what happened to Sylvie, but then there's this part at the end where you see Amy back in America with her parents and she's celebrating Christmas. And I think there's sort of a resolution for the characters in the Netherlands as well. I don't know. I think it is sort of the best attempt at a happy ending. It seems like they've all they've all, I think, taken the best things they can from Sylvie's death, realizing what happened to her. And I think it was also a wise decision by Jean Kwok to sort of take this very dark, very sad book with all these secrets and leave it on at least some sort of a hopeful and what I thought was a happy ending.
I can see where you're coming from, but I definitely thought it was a tragic, depressing ending. And as I was processing the shock first of realizing it wasn't a murder, that she had actually committed suicide, I realized that I would have preferred for her to have been murdered, which took me aback by a second. And then I realized it's because, not because I prefer murder over suicide, but because the suicide just felt so preventable if everybody had just been more upfront and honest with her, and all that it involved was just being a closer unit as a family, and people were just so stuck in their tragic roles that they weren't able to move past it, and Sylvie paid the price.
I agree. I think it was definitely not a happy ending, just because removing Sylvie, which for a lot of the story, technically she was the problem. So just removing her did not make anyone's life better. And it's just, I was so sad when she had the pills and drove off. I was kind of like you, it's like, oh, what are you doing? Just because it's I could visualize her life and her pain, and then just plunging into water. Yeah, you can't reverse that. It was just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I definitely agree that it was more of a tragedy. It seemed more like Sylvie spent her whole life suffering and living a farce just so at the end of her life everyone could finally have to air their dirty laundry and then move on with their lives. Like, thank you for all your years of agony and torment. Now we can finally like move past our problems.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is there part of the plot you would change? Anybody?
At first I thought I would. At first I thought, it's Ma's fault. If she would have been up front, if Ma would have, then we wouldn't have the story that we have. But the part of the plot that it's such a good story, and it's so well written. And I think the essence of it would be different if it had been changed. But I would love to have had her live and maybe figure some things out. But realistically in life, that doesn't always happen.
I think for me, changing it from a suicide to a murder would have been better. Change the plot that way, but
Any other comments or questions about the book?
I really enjoyed it, though. It was very sad, and there were, especially when I listened to it. When I was first listening to it, I thought, I don't know if I'm going to make it through this melancholy, sad book. But the characters were just fantastically written. They had so much emotion, and the story, the twist, I could not have come up with those.
Yeah, I liked how you got aspects of Chinese culture and the Dutch culture as well. It was parts you don't always see. I mean, maybe they go to these places in these types of books, but they don't treat it with, I think, as much respect or detail as was done here. So I really appreciated that.
I agree. And I think if you look up Jean Kwok, the author, and her life, it's interesting that she actually has lived in all three places and is trilingual. And the story was inspired by her brother's death. He was lost in a plane crash. So it's just, I think it adds another layer of interest to what happened in the story, and has a much more greater impact.
our next book will be in June, and we are doing the one book Nebraska book, Prairie Forge, which is about the scrap metal drive. Back, was it World War II, correct? I don't have the book with me, I'm so sorry. But yeah, we'll be discussing that in June.
Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a great night.